By the final quarter of 1944, the European theater of World War II was undergoing a series of accelerated transformations. The Axis front was collapsing along multiple sectors, and Hungary, a long-standing German ally, had become both a strategic keystone and a political liability for Berlin. The Soviet Union's rapid advance through Eastern Europe, exemplified by the Jassy-Kishinev offensive and the fall of Romania in August 1944, had brought the Red Army to the borders of northern Transylvania and Carpatho-Ukraine. The Carpathian Mountains, historically a natural barrier and the gateway into Hungary proper, now became the next expected line of resistance. The Carpathians were not only a geographic frontier, but also a symbolic and strategic demarcation. For Hungary, they represented a shield against invasion. For Germany, a line to slow the Soviet tide. And for the Soviets, a necessary path toward the conquest of Budapest and access to Austria. The line stretched across what had once been Czechoslovak and Polish territories, but was, since the 1939-41 border revisions, largely incorporated into Hungary and occupied by the Wehrmacht. Politically, Hungary was in turmoil. Regent Miklós Horthy, sensing imminent defeat and under pressure from both internal factions and Allied overtures, had attempted to negotiate Hungary's exit from the war. This led directly to Operation Panzerfaust in October 1944, during which German forces, specifically Waffen-SS units under Otto Skorzeny, seized Horthy's son and forced the regent to resign. In his place, the Germans installed the Arrow Cross regime under Ferenc Szálasi, ensuring Hungary's continued commitment to the Axis war effort under German influence. Militarily, the German and Hungarian forces were stretched thin. Many seasoned divisions had been redeployed to face the Allied advance in France or were destroyed in the encirclements of summer 1944. Reinforcements were inadequate, and supply lines through Austria and Slovakia were increasingly disrupted by partisans and Allied bombing. The German High Command had begun to rely more heavily on locally raised formations, including units of the Waffen-SS composed of ethnic Hungarians, Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans living outside the Reich, and volunteers from annexed or occupied regions. Among these formations, one of the most controversial was the 25th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS Hunyadi, 1st Hungarian, which had begun forming in late 1944. However, it would be other smaller Hungarian SS units, hastily assembled and less formalized, that would bear the burden of holding key mountain passes during the coming Soviet assault. These ad hoc formations were composed of remnants of the Hungarian Honvédség, Royal Army, Volksdeutsche battalions, and Waffen-SS cadres returned from the Balkans and Galicia. Their composition was mixed in training, experience, and cohesion, yet they would soon be thrust into defensive roles of critical importance. From the Soviet perspective, the offensive into the Carpathians was part of a broader strategic vision. After the success of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive and the absorption of Romania and Bulgaria into the Allied camp, Stalin's attention turned westward. The 4th Ukrainian Front, commanded by General Ivan Petrov, was tasked with pushing through the Carpathian passes, Uzsuk, Vereke, and Jablon, and into the Hungarian interior. The terrain posed enormous logistical challenges: narrow valleys, dense forests, limited rail access, and early snowfall delayed movements and hampered supply. Despite this, Soviet intelligence assessments estimated that German and Hungarian forces in the region were depleted, demoralized, and incapable of prolonged resistance. This conclusion, later proven to be inaccurate in key sectors, shaped Soviet planning by encouraging the use of concentrated infantry assaults with limited armored support, supplemented by local cooperation from partisans and Red Army auxiliary units. The civilian populations of Carpatho-Ukraine, Transylvania, and northern Hungary faced a shifting mosaic of control, violence, and uncertainty. Ruthenians, Hungarians, Slovaks, Germans, Jews, and Romanians all lived within proximity, and their experiences of the front varied widely. Many were conscripted, others displaced. Some cooperated with occupying forces, while others supported partisan activities or simply tried to survive amid the chaos of war. The Hungarian Waffen-SS, though controversial in both German and Hungarian historiography, found itself in a position of increased operational relevance. With conventional Axis units either withdrawn or destroyed, the German command structure increasingly turned to these irregular or semi-regular formations to plug gaps along critical defensive lines. Their presence in the Carpathians was less a strategic plan and more an act of necessity, dictated by the availability of personnel and the urgency of the Soviet advance. By October 1944, Soviet forward elements had reached the southern edge of the Carpathians. German and Hungarian engineers worked frantically to mine mountain roads, prepare fallback positions, and reinforce outdated fortifications from the First World War era. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Snow fell early, and communication between units became difficult. In these conditions, isolated Waffen-SS companies, many of them Hungarian-speaking and operating with limited support, were tasked with delaying or stopping entire Soviet battalions. Thus, the stage was set, with political instability in Budapest, overstretched German commands, and a vast Soviet war machine pressing westward. The Carpathians became both a crucible and a cul-de-sac. The Hungarian Waffen-SS, relatively unknown and often misunderstood in broader narratives of the war, would be forced into a role for which few were prepared, defending a collapsing front, largely alone, against one of the most experienced armies of the Second World War. By early October 1944, the front lines in the Carpathian Mountains began to shift. The Fourth Ukrainian Front initiated probing attacks along the eastern slopes of the Carpathians, testing the resistance of Axis forces and assessing terrain feasibility for a larger push. In response, the German High Command issued Field Order 673, directing defensive formations to fortify the mountain passes using all available local resources, including Hungarian Waffen-SS detachments and retreating remnants of the Honvédség. At the forefront of the defense was the so-called Carpathian Shield Line, a loosely coordinated series of defensive positions stretching from the Uzsok Pass in the north to the Jew Valley further south. The sectors near Uzhhorod, Mukachevo, and Kust became particularly vital due to their road and rail access into Hungary's interior. Responsibility for holding these lines fell disproportionately on understrength battle groups, including companies from the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Reichsführer SS, reinforced by elements of the 1st Hungarian SS Volunteers and Volksdeutsche militia units from the Sub-Carpathian region. Key commanders included SS Sturmbannführer Rolf Hültermann and Hungarian Colonel Laszlo Deák, who coordinated the deployment of forces into narrow valleys, dense forests, and partially fortified ridge positions. Despite receiving only limited artillery and no heavy armored support, these units used terrain familiarity and mountain warfare tactics to ambush Soviet patrols, slow logistical movements, and destroy bridges ahead of advancing columns. The Red Army's initial push, Operation Carpathian Sweep, began on 8 October 1944, spearheaded by the 18th Army and elements of the 1st Guards Rifle Corps. The Soviet advance was methodical, supported by engineer battalions tasked with clearing mines and repairing roads as they progressed through the valleys. However, steep inclines, poor weather, and localized Axis countermeasures quickly disrupted the tempo of the offensive. Fighting near the Uzsok Pass intensified during the second week of October. A battle group under SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Reti, composed largely of Hungarian Volksdeutsche Volunteers and reinforced by 2 batteries of light artillery, managed to hold Soviet advances for 5 days by leveraging elevated fire positions and extensive booby traps laid along forested paths. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Soviet reports indicate over 1,100 men wounded or killed in the sector between 10 to 15 October, while Hungarian SS records cite losses of approximately 300, many due to frostbite and exposure. In Mukachevo, the Hungarian 1st SS Battalion constructed defensive barricades throughout the town and along access roads leading to the Latorica River. Urban fighting erupted on 17 October as Soviet reconnaissance units entered the outskirts. Hungarian units relied on sniper teams and explosives to hold key intersections, delaying the Soviet advance for 48 hours before withdrawing west under cover of darkness. Civilians, many of whom were ethnic Hungarians or Ruthenians, faced forced evacuations, requisitioning of livestock, and destruction of homes used for military purposes. The presence of displaced persons grew rapidly, with an estimated 35,000 civilians fleeing the southern passes by the end of the month. The Arrow Cross government in Budapest, newly installed and dependent on German support, issued Directive 14B on 19 October, formalizing the operational status of all Hungarian Waffen-SS units as auxiliary formations within the German command hierarchy. This directive also authorized conscription of additional ethnic Hungarians between the ages of 17 and 45, with the stated goal of reinforcing mountain sectors and safeguarding Hungarian territory. Supply shortages became acute, the mountainous terrain severely restricted logistics, and German aerial resupply efforts were inconsistent due to Soviet air superiority in the region. Airdrops from Luftwaffe, Heinkel, He, 105 delivered ammunition and rations sporadically, but poor weather and Soviet anti-aircraft fire resulted in high losses. One notable incident occurred on 21 October, when 3 He-111s were shot down near the Tisa River, prompting the suspension of daylight airdrops. Meanwhile, morale among Axis defenders was mixed. Some Hungarian SS troops viewed their mission as a defense of national territory and showed resilience under fire. Others, particularly among the less trained conscripts and Volksdeutsche militia, struggled with command discipline and desertions. German liaison officers reported instances of insubordination and supply hoarding, while Hungarian officers protested the lack of artillery and reinforcements from the central command. In the Soviet camp, frustrations mounted as the offensive lagged behind timetable projections. Terrain challenges were compounded by Axis use of demolitions and sniping, forcing Soviet engineers to clear hundreds of obstacles under fire. Reports from the 4th Ukrainian Front indicate increased reliance on local informants and partisan collaborators to identify weak points in the Axis lines. Despite the attrition, Soviet forces managed to take control of several key junctions, including the railway station at Volovets and forward positions near Svaliava. These gains, however, came at the cost of over 3,500 Red Army casualties during the final weeks of October. The Soviet High Command was beginning to realize that its assumptions about an easy passage through the Carpathians had underestimated the resistance posed by local SS and militia formations operating with intimate knowledge of the terrain. As October ended, both sides prepared for renewed confrontations. The Soviets began regrouping their mountain infantry battalions and shifting artillery forward. On the Axis side, scattered units consolidated into mountain groups, Gebirgsgruppen, under centralized command, reinforcing critical passes and planning for delaying actions through November. The opening phase of the Carpathian battles had concluded. While the Red Army made measurable progress, the cost and delay far exceeded expectations. And for the Hungarian Waffen-SS units still holding scattered strongpoints amid snow-covered ridges and crumbling defenses, the campaign was only beginning. By early November 1944, Soviet High Command had grown increasingly frustrated with the pace and cost of the Carpathian campaign. The 4th Ukrainian Front, tasked with breaching the mountainous line and opening the path into central Hungary, had extended its supply routes deep into hostile terrain. The Red Army's strategic objective remained clear: to cross the main Carpathian Ridge, neutralize all remaining Axis resistance, and open the road to Budapest via the Great Hungarian Plain. Yet the defense mounted by Hungarian Waffen-SS detachments and Volksdeutsche irregulars continued to complicate these efforts. In response, the Stavka authorized a realignment of forces and ordered General Ivan Petrov to reinforce the offensive with the 8th Guards Army and additional armored brigades, despite the limited usefulness of tanks in steep, muddy mountain passes. Soviet logistics faced immense strain. Artillery had to be disassembled and hauled uphill by mule trains or tractors. Gasoline shortages meant that mechanized units often advanced at the speed of foot infantry. Soviet engineers constructed temporary roads along ravines and ridgelines, frequently under fire. In the Uzhhorod sector alone, over 14 bridges were built and rebuilt within a 3-week period due to Axis sabotage. Meanwhile, the Hungarian SS formations continued to adapt. Elements of the 25th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS Hunyadi began arriving from the rear, having completed their training in southern Germany. Although not yet at full combat strength, these reinforcements were quickly integrated into existing mountain defensive groups. Their arrival allowed for a more coordinated defensive grid across the Carpathian passes, particularly in areas like Vyshkov and Rakiv. On the 5th of November, Soviet infantry launched an assault on the Tatar Pass, using a combination of shock troops and flamethrower detachments to dislodge Hungarian machine gun nests embedded in mountain rock shelters. The defenders, primarily from the 1st Hungarian SS Mountain Company and local auxiliary units, employed coordinated fire from concealed emplacements and retreated in staggered withdrawals, inflicting high casualties before finally ceding the heights. Soviet reports cited over 600 men lost in that single engagement. The harsh terrain began to affect not only tactics but morale. Soviet troops struggled with exposure, frostbite, and low rations as the weather deteriorated. Axis troops, although no better supplied, were often better acclimated and more familiar with the local geography. Hungarian commanders exploited this advantage by launching night raids and infiltration missions to disrupt Soviet artillery positions. One such raid on 9 November led to the destruction of 2 Soviet 76mm field guns near the village of Yasenia and the capture of several crates of ammunition, which were later used in the defense of the nearby pass. Civilians continued to suffer. In mountain hamlets caught between the lines, supplies vanished, and many homes were requisitioned by retreating forces. The Ruthenian population, already fractured by ethnic tensions and wartime occupation, found itself under scrutiny from both sides. Soviet security units often detained locals suspected of aiding Axis units, while the Hungarian authorities, still officially under the Arrow Cross government, imposed forced labor requirements and recruited young men into SS reserve formations. Between 1 and 20th of November, local administrators reported the disappearance of over 4,200 civilians from the Carpathian border villages, some fleeing, others taken into custody or conscripted. By mid-November, Soviet forces succeeded in breaching the Uzhhorod-Svaliava line. The 18th Army advanced through the snow-covered valleys of the Borzova River, seizing key road junctions. However, attempts to encircle Axis defenders at Kust failed when Hungarian and German units conducted a disciplined withdrawal westward, abandoning fixed positions to avoid being trapped. Their retreat was covered by small demolition squads, who disabled bridges and laid extensive minefields behind them. Red Army sappers reported discovering over 3,500 mines in a single valley near Irshava. Despite the withdrawal, the Axis command viewed the defense as a temporary success. The aim had never been to hold the entirety of the Carpathians indefinitely, but to delay the Soviet breakthrough long enough to secure Hungarian heartland defenses. Every week of delay gave the Wehrmacht and Arrow Cross leadership more time to reorganize and prepare for the impending Battle of Budapest. To further slow the advance, German engineers oversaw the controlled destruction of tunnel infrastructure, such as the Teresva rail tunnel, which collapsed under a timed charge on 18th of November. This hindered Soviet supply movement and forced a rerouting of armored units. The lack of effective rail access severely limited Soviet mechanized deployment beyond the mountain spine. On 21st November, a Soviet offensive aimed at Volovets Pass began with a heavy artillery bombardment and the deployment of fresh infantry from the 1st Guards Corps. However, the Hungarian SS defenders, forewarned by reconnaissance and with prepared fallback positions, absorbed the assault and launched a counterattack from adjacent ridgelines. The counterattack, though eventually repelled, inflicted several hundred Soviet casualties and destroyed 6 anti-tank guns. It underscored the continued ability of the Hungarian defenders to mount localized resistance despite strategic disadvantage. By the end of the month, winter conditions worsened. Snow blanketed the peaks, rendering vehicle movement almost impossible in some sectors. Soviet artillery was increasingly ineffective, and air support was limited by low visibility. The Red Army resorted to infantry advances, often through chest-high snow, with supplies dragged by pack animals. Medical evacuations became nearly impossible, and both sides suffered from exposure and disease. Reports indicate that non-combat losses from frostbite, pneumonia, and starvation exceeded 9,000 for the Red Army and 4,000 for Axis forces by late November. At this stage, the battle for the Carpathians had become a test of endurance rather than maneuver. The Hungarian Waffen-SS, initially underestimated by Soviet planners, continued to fight in dispersed groups, maintaining control over several strategic elevations. Their resistance slowed the Soviet timetable for an assault on Budapest by at least 3 weeks, an outcome that had wide-reaching implications for the larger Eastern Front dynamics. However, pressure mounted. The Red Army now controlled most major routes through the Eastern Carpathians. The next phase would determine whether the remaining Axis defenders could continue their delaying actions or be overwhelmed by the sheer weight of Soviet numbers and winter attrition. The battle was approaching a decisive threshold. By early December 1944, the Soviet offensive had reached a critical juncture. The Carpathian ridges, once formidable natural barriers, were now pocked with Soviet outposts and artillery emplacements. Yet, despite weeks of sustained pressure, a complete breakthrough had not materialized. Soviet commanders now faced a dilemma: push further into the mountains under worsening winter conditions, or consolidate gains and wait for spring. Stalin's directive left little room for hesitation. Budapest had to fall before the Western Allies made further advances into Central Europe, and the Carpathians had to be breached decisively to open the gateway. The Hungarian Waffen-SS and associated German units recognized this urgency as well, although their numbers remained limited, estimated at just under 28,000 men across the defensive zone. Their familiarity with the terrain, defensive discipline, and willingness to carry out suicidal rearguard actions allowed them to control key choke points. Reinforced by Volkssturm detachments and remnants of Hungarian Royal Army units loyal to the Arrow Cross regime, the defenders established layered fallback positions across the valleys, leading to Debrecen and Nyíregyháza. The Carpathians had become not just a geographical obstacle, but a symbolic last stand for Hungary's fractured war effort. Between 3 and 10th of December, the Soviet 4th Ukrainian Front launched a series of coordinated assaults intended to shatter the final resistance across the main passes. The heaviest fighting occurred at the Voretsky Pass, a strategic corridor where Soviet artillery had been massed for over a week. After a preparatory barrage lasting nearly 6 hours, infantry battalions advanced in waves, supported by flamethrower squads and limited T-34 support. The defenders, primarily Hungarian SS mountain troops entrenched along switchback trails, opened fire from camouflage bunkers and ridgeline trenches. Casualties were severe. The Red Army's 107th Rifle Division alone reported over 1,200 losses in 2 days, much of it due to mines and booby traps left during stage withdrawals. Soviet medics were overwhelmed, and wounded soldiers often lay in the snow for hours before being reached. Despite this, by 11th December, Soviet units had secured the pass, though at the cost of heavy attrition. Soviet engineers immediately began clearing debris and constructing supply roads, but the process was slowed by continued sniper fire and freezing conditions. Simultaneously in the Ráhív sector, Hungarian forces executed a textbook tactical withdrawal under cover of darkness. Abandoning their last fixed positions on the eastern slopes, they destroyed ammunition caches and communication lines before retreating into forested ravines. The maneuver, although small in scale, bought the defenders valuable time. Their next line of defense, around Korolevo and the Tiza River bend, would require Soviet troops to engage again without momentum or logistical readiness. Soviet intelligence underestimated the extent of the Hungarian defensive reorganization. A hastily assembled Red Army push toward Berehov, initiated on the 14th of December, ran into a complex web of anti-tank obstacles, machine gun nests, and pre-sighted artillery coordinates. The assault was repelled, and Soviet units were forced to retreat, losing several armored vehicles in the process. This engagement, though minor compared to earlier battles, had outsized psychological effects. Reports circulated among Soviet ranks of elite mountain ghosts, SS troops who could vanish into the snow and strike from unseen cliffs. While exaggerated, such stories reflected the fatigue and frustration of Soviet infantry in an increasingly attritional campaign. Further west, along the Satu Mare approach, Romanian participation in the Soviet offensive became more pronounced. Since switching sides in August 1944, Romanian forces under General Avramescu had provided flanking support for the Red Army. Their presence, however, introduced new tensions. Hungarian SS units regarded Romanian troops with particular hostility, often refusing surrender to them and fighting to the last man in engagements around Halmu and Tarna Mare. In one instance, a Romanian battalion captured a Hungarian position, only to find all defenders dead, many from self-inflicted wounds. These episodes intensified the brutal tone of the conflict, with quarter rarely asked or given on either side. Civilians continued to suffer immensely. The village of Velikie Bereznie, once a way station for lumber merchants and shepherds, became a frozen battleground. Its church tower was used by Hungarian observers and subsequently targeted by Soviet mortars. When the tower collapsed, it crushed several homes beneath it. The town's population dwindled from 1,200 to under 300 within 2 weeks. Some were killed in crossfire, others fled into the mountains, and a few were conscripted into Soviet labor units or detained under suspicion of collaboration. By mid-December, signs emerged that the tide was finally turning. Soviet air reconnaissance confirmed large-scale withdrawals from secondary ridgelines west of Mukachevo. These retreats were not panicked, but rather calculated moves to preserve manpower for the final defense of Hungary's core territory. Soviet analysts now identified the Hungarian SS formations not as independent battle groups, but as part of a coordinated delay strategy orchestrated by German command elements in the region. This realization prompted a reassessment of Soviet operational goals. Rather than expend further resources in mountainous skirmishes, Soviet planners began shifting focus toward enveloping maneuvers via the plains south of the Carpathians. These movements aimed to isolate the remaining mountain defenders from the rest of the Hungarian theater, effectively rendering their position untenable. To support this, heavy artillery was redirected toward Nagy Zolos and Beregzaj, and Soviet mechanized brigades began probing weaker flanks. Still, remnants of the Hungarian Waffen-SS continued to resist. In the forests above Svaliava, a small group of Hungarian mountain troops held a ridge for over 5 days, surrounded and without resupply. They conducted limited sorties at night, targeting Soviet ammunition wagons and even attempting a raid on a field hospital. Only after a combination of sustained artillery fire and starvation did the survivors surrender. Fewer than 24 remained from an original company of 150. By 20 December, the Carpathian sector had largely stabilized. Soviet forces controlled all major passes and routes, but resistance continued in isolated pockets. The price had been immense: thousands of Red Army casualties, hundreds of destroyed vehicles, and a delayed timetable for the Budapest offensive. On the Axis side, the Hungarian SS had lost most of its organized strength, but succeeded in delaying the Soviet advance by nearly 2 months, time that would prove critical in the defense of Hungary's capital. As Christmas approached, the once remote valleys of the Carpathians stood silent, scarred by craters, burned-out bunkers, and frozen bodies half buried in snow. Yet for the defenders who remained, the war was not over. The fight would continue, now not for the mountains, but for the cities beyond them. By late December 1944, the Soviet advance across the Carpathians had officially breached the last natural line of defense on Hungary's eastern frontier. But this strategic success did not immediately translate into operational fluidity. The Red Army now faced a new challenge: sustaining momentum across the Hungarian plain while coping with overextended supply lines, weather-degraded roads, and persistent resistance from Hungarian and German rearguard elements. As the front lines shifted westward, the role of the Hungarian Waffen-SS evolved, from that of entrenched mountain defenders to mobile units tasked with delaying actions and harassment operations along vital corridors. The remnants of the 25th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS Hunyadi, 1st Hungarian, regrouped near Debrecen under orders to assist in protecting the approaches to the Tisza River crossings. Although technically under German command, operational autonomy allowed the Hungarian officers to coordinate defensive efforts with local gendarmerie, militia, and loyalist army holdouts. These forces, estimated at 8,000 to 1,000 men, were dispersed along a front nearly 90 kilometers wide. Despite inferior numbers, their use of terrain, preset demolition points, and knowledge of village networks allowed them to temporarily stall Soviet mechanized columns. Between 21 and 26 December, the Soviet 53rd Army attempted to cross the Tisza River near Szolnok. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges under artillery cover, while assault troops pressed forward in narrow columns. However, Hungarian SS units executed repeated night raids, destroying several pontoon sections and forcing the Soviets to divert resources toward bridge protection. The delays accumulated. By 27 December, only half the Red Army's forward elements had made the crossing. This stalling pattern would continue throughout early January 1945, as the defenders adapted to new terrain, while implementing lessons learned in the Carpathians. The Hungarian SS employed flexible tactics, deploying sniper teams, camouflaged anti-tank guns, and ambush units operating on bicycles and horse-drawn sleds. These units avoided direct confrontation, instead aiming to slow Soviet convoys, sabotage fuel stores, and destroy communication lines. The terrain of the Great Hungarian Plain offered few natural fortifications, but scattered forests and rivers provided limited cover for mobile warfare. Skirmishes became the dominant form of engagement, with no clear front line, only shifting zones of control punctuated by roadblocks and burning wrecks. In the village of Mezitor, Hungarian SS troops ambushed a Soviet supply convoy en route to Kecskemét. Using Molotov cocktails and captured Panzerfausts, they disabled several trucks and killed over 30 Soviet personnel. The response was swift. Soviet tanks encircled the village and shelled it for over 3 hours. When they entered, most of the attackers had already vanished. The villagers, caught in the crossfire, suffered heavily. Dozens of homes were destroyed, and the local population faced reprisals from both sides. This cycle of guerrilla attack and punitive retaliation became a grim norm across the central Hungarian core. Meanwhile, the command structure of the Hungarian Waffen-SS underwent rapid transformation. Communication with Berlin was unreliable, and German high command, increasingly preoccupied with the Ardennes offensive in the west, allocated minimal resources to the Hungarian front. As a result, SS General Ferenc Fekete reorganized surviving units into mobile Kampfgruppen, autonomous battle groups composed of infantry, light artillery, and demolition squads. These formations operated semi-independently, often coordinating directly with local Nazi-loyal militias rather than regular Wehrmacht forces. Soviet commanders viewed the Hungarian SS with a mix of frustration and strategic curiosity. Intelligence intercepts revealed that, despite collapsing morale in some Wehrmacht sectors, these Hungarian units remained operationally coherent and ideologically motivated. Propaganda leaflets dropped over encampments offered amnesty to defectors and assurances of humane treatment. The response was limited. Of the 750 SS prisoners taken during the Tisza operations in late December, fewer than 60 had surrendered voluntarily. Weather again played a decisive role. A prolonged cold snap in early January froze rivers and turned marshes into passable fields for tanks. This shift favored Soviet armored units, particularly the 6th Guards Tank Army, which resumed a push westward towards Székesfehérvár. However, frozen conditions also aided Hungarian defenders, who used icy canals and narrow valleys to funnel tanks into kill zones. At Cegléd, a Soviet tank platoon advanced along what appeared to be a cleared road, only to find themselves bracketed by hidden anti-tank teams, using artillery pieces scavenged from abandoned German positions. 3 T-34s were destroyed in under 10 minutes before air support could intervene. Civilians remained caught in the middle. The civilian infrastructure of central Hungary had not recovered from the earlier German retreat. and now found itself doubly burdened by advancing Soviets and withdrawing Axis units. Food stocks were requisitioned by both sides, and many towns saw their population decrease by half within weeks. In some cases, Hungarian SS officers tried to maintain local order by enforcing curfews and distributing limited rations. In others, disorder reigned. Banditry, revenge killings, and spontaneous evacuations hollowed out communities that had been inhabited for centuries. In Budapest, political leadership under the Arrow Cross Party grew increasingly detached from battlefield realities. Radio broadcasts continued to promise victory and retribution, even as Soviet shells began falling on the city's outskirts. SS officers from the Carpathian campaign were called into the capital to assist with final defenses. Many viewed the summons as a death sentence. Reports indicate that at least one unit refused the order and instead attempted to break westward toward Austria, hoping to surrender to Western Allied forces. Their fate remains unclear, but Soviet records list a running firefight near Veszprém, in which an unidentified group was encircled and annihilated. As the new year began, the Hungarian Waffen-SS were no longer acting as a traditional fighting force. They had become a delaying mechanism, an increasingly desperate bulwark in a war whose outcome was no longer in doubt. Yet their resistance continued, driven by a mix of ideology, survival instinct, and loyalty to a collapsing regime. The Carpathians were now behind them, but their symbolic weight lingered, a reminder of the high ground lost and the lengths to which the defenders had gone to hold it. The campaign moved west, but for many, the scars of the Carpathian winter would never fade. By mid-January 1945, the Hungarian Waffen-SS, already diminished by sustained combat and harsh winter attrition, found themselves at the heart of one of the most intense episodes of urban warfare in Eastern Europe, the Siege of Budapest. While the primary defense of the city was officially entrusted to the Nyos SS Mountain Corps under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Karl Pfeffer-Wildenbruch, the Hungarian Waffen-SS units, especially elements of the Hunyadi Division and auxiliary formations drawn from remnants of the Royal Hungarian Army, played a critical role in manning key sectors of the encircled capital. Budapest, divided by the Danube into Buda and Pest, became a symbolic and strategic focal point. Adolf Hitler had declared the city a Festung, fortress, which was to be defended to the last man. For the Hungarian SS, this was a final stand not only in service to the Axis cause, but also as a matter of national pride. Orders were clear: hold the city against overwhelming Soviet forces regardless of losses. Approximately 79,000 Axis defenders, including 3,000 Hungarian troops, were trapped within the siege ring as the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts launched coordinated attacks. The Hungarian Waffen-SS units were assigned to various urban sectors, including the Castle District, the southern railway junctions, and the strategic Gellert Hill. Equipped mostly with small arms, a dwindling stock of Panzerfausts, and a few armored vehicles scavenged from earlier battles, they improvised defenses by barricading streets with rubble, mining bridges, and fortifying sewer entrances. Lacking air support and with artillery shells in short supply, they relied increasingly on close-quarters ambushes and sniper fire from upper stories of buildings. In Pest, the densely built inner districts became scenes of brutal house-to-house combat. Hungarian SS squads, often operating in groups of 6 to 8 men, occupied apartment blocks and used connecting attic spaces and cellars to maneuver undetected between buildings. Soviet infantry, backed by tanks and self-propelled guns, were forced to clear each structure floor by floor. In one instance near the Nyugati railway station, a Hungarian SS demolition team successfully destroyed a T-34 by collapsing a section of ceiling on it using preset explosives. Despite the fierce defense, Soviet superiority in manpower and materiel began to tell. The Red Army employed storm group tactics, compact units of riflemen, sappers, and flamethrower operators designed specifically to flush out fortified positions. As sectors fell, Hungarian defenders withdrew across the frozen Danube into Buda, often under covering fire from remaining artillery pieces on Margaret Island. The crossing was perilous. Soviet snipers and machine gunners targeted every visible movement on the ice. Hundreds were killed during the retreat, yet thousands managed to regroup on the western bank. In Buda, the defense became more desperate. The terrain favored defenders. Hills, narrow streets, and old fortifications created natural choke points. The Hungarian Waffen-SS, now operating under extreme shortages of food and ammunition, resorted to extreme measures, melting snow for water, stripping copper wiring from buildings to fashion makeshift booby traps, and even reusing Soviet munitions whenever possible. Command structures became fragmented, with junior officers taking autonomous control of their sectors. Communications with central headquarters often failed, and field decisions were made on instinct and terrain familiarity. One of the last functioning Hungarian radio transmitters broadcasted a message on 5th of February, reportedly urging rural Hungarians to rise against the Soviet invaders, and claiming that Budapest still held firm. In reality, the defenders were being compressed into a final defensive perimeter around the Buda castle. The Hungarian Waffen-SS fought alongside German units, including the 13th Panzer Division and remnants of elite German SS battalions. Cooperation remained professional but strained, with Hungarian units occasionally ignored in resupply or denied retreat routes in favor of German units. Morale among Hungarian civilians still inside Buda was complex. Some viewed the SS fighters as protectors. Others saw them as prolonging inevitable destruction. Food became scarcer each day. Hospitals overflowed. Corpses lay unburied in courtyards and stairwells. Hungarian Waffen-SS medics, though limited in number, attempted to treat both soldiers and civilians, often improvising with rags, alcohol, and captured Soviet supplies. Yet by early February, conditions in the hospitals were described as medieval, with gangrene, typhus, and starvation rampant. On 11th of February, with the situation clearly untenable, the decision was made by the Axis command to attempt a breakout. Hungarian Waffen-SS units formed part of the three-pronged assault designed to pierce Soviet lines and reach Axis-held territory west of the city. The breakout was launched at night, under the cover of darkness and snowfall. Of the roughly 5,000 Hungarian SS troops who began the maneuver, fewer than 600 successfully reached friendly lines. The rest were killed, captured, or scattered in the hills and villages west of Budapest. Those captured by Soviet forces faced grim fates. Many were summarily executed. Others were marched to temporary holding camps, where interrogations and deportations began. Few Hungarian Waffen-SS fighters expected leniency. Most had burned their identification papers and removed insignias, hoping to blend into the civilian population or claim to be forcibly conscripted. Soviet counterintelligence, however, had prepared extensively and used photographs, informants, and tattoo checks to identify SS members. The fall of Budapest on 13th of February 1945 marked the end of organized Hungarian military resistance within national borders. The Hungarian Waffen-SS, which had once pledged itself as a bulwark against communism and a partner in Hitler's vision of a new Europe, now existed only in fragments. Survivors regrouped near Lake Balaton, where the last significant German-Hungarian counteroffensive would take place in March. For those who endured the siege, the defense of Budapest remained both a symbol of national sacrifice and a bitter reminder of a war fought in the shadows of political agendas and foreign commands. What lingered most were the ruins, both material and psychological. Nearly half of Budapest's buildings were destroyed or uninhabitable. Over 38,000 civilians had died in the siege. The city that had once been a crown jewel of the Austro-Hungarian Empire now lay in smoldering ruin. The Hungarian Waffen-SS had made their stand, not for conquest, but for survival, autonomy, and a fading ideology. Their last major battle was over, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Following the catastrophic fall of Budapest, the remnants of the Hungarian Waffen-SS found themselves scattered across western Hungary and Austria. Many survivors regrouped near Lake Balaton, forming fragmented battalion-level formations under German operational command. It was here, in the early spring of 1945, that Operation Frühlingserwachen, Germany's final major offensive of the war was launched, with Hungarian Waffen-SS units participating in what would become their last organized combat effort. Operation Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening, initiated on the 6th of March 1945, aimed to secure the vital oil fields near Nagy Kanica and to stabilize the southern front. The operation involved elite German formations, such as the 6th SS Panzer Army, which had recently been redeployed from the Ardennes, as well as the remnants of the Hungarian Third Army and Waffen-SS contingents. The Hungarian SS fighters, primarily those from the decimated 25th and 26th Divisions, were tasked with reconnaissance, flank security, and, in some sectors, spearheading assaults through marshland and partially thawed terrain. Despite efforts to rearm and regroup, these units faced overwhelming logistical and environmental challenges. Fuel shortages limited armored mobility. Artillery support was constrained by dwindling shell supplies. Spring thaws turned roads into mud-choked corridors, slowing mechanized movement to a crawl. Hungarian Waffen-SS formations, never fully resupplied after Budapest, entered battle with outdated small arms, insufficient winter gear, and little heavy support. Some companies were reportedly formed from a mix of SS volunteers, Hungarian reservists, and raw conscripts with minimal training. Their morale, however, remained surprisingly resolute. Propaganda emphasized the defense of the homeland and the protection of Hungarian sovereignty against Soviet expansion. Many Hungarian SS fighters viewed this final campaign not as a gesture of loyalty to the Reich, but as a desperate effort to secure their country's future bargaining position. Others simply had no alternative. Retreat meant Soviet captivity. Surrender, in many cases, meant execution. Initial advances around Lake Velence and towards Székesfehérvár achieved tactical surprise. Hungarian SS recon elements engaged Soviet screening units and briefly penetrated forward positions of the 27th Soviet Army. However, within days, the momentum stalled. Soviet forces counterattacked with overwhelming artillery and air superiority. Units from the 4th Guards Army and 6th Guards Tank Army, reinforced by fresh reserves, rapidly stabilized the front. Hungarian Waffen-SS units suffered heavy casualties attempting to hold exposed flanks along the Sarvise Canal and in the dense forests near Varpalota. By mid-March, the entire operation collapsed. German High Command ordered a general withdrawal. Hungarian SS remnants retreated toward the Austrian border, often on foot, under constant harassment from Soviet aircraft and partisan bands. Some units disintegrated entirely. Others regrouped near Sopron and entered Austria, where they hoped to surrender to Western Allied forces. Throughout this retreat, discipline began to erode. Desertions increased. Ammunition was reserved only for defensive actions or to prevent capture. Amid this chaos, scattered Hungarian Waffen-SS elements began engaging in small-scale defensive operations within Austrian villages and Alpine passes. These were often uncoordinated and driven more by necessity than strategy. In several cases, Hungarian SS groups assisted German rearguard actions, covering the withdrawal of civilians and wounded across the border. In one documented case near Glognitz, a mixed Hungarian-German detachment successfully held a mountain pass against a Soviet probing force for 48 hours, allowing thousands of refugees to escape. With the collapse of organized resistance by April 1945, most Hungarian Waffen-SS fighters found themselves surrounded or trapped. Those who managed to reach the western zones of occupation attempted to surrender to British or American forces, believing they would receive more lenient treatment. Some were accepted into captivity, while others were handed over to Soviet authorities under repatriation agreements. For many, this meant years of forced labor in the Gulag, or execution after summary trials in Hungary. Within Hungary itself, the collapse of Axis authority led to the re-establishment of a provisional government under Soviet auspices. Former Waffen-SS members were declared enemies of the state. Many were hunted down, imprisoned, or executed. Some attempted to go underground, using false identities, or relying on sympathetic rural communities for shelter. Others fled to Argentina, Spain, or Canada using post-war ratlines supported by sympathetic clergy or former intelligence contacts. The image of the Hungarian Waffen-SS became politically toxic in the post-war environment. In Soviet-aligned historiography, they were uniformly described as traitors, fascist collaborators, or war criminals. Their motivations, be they nationalistic, anti-communist, or coerced, were erased or ignored. Trials of former members often relied on forced confessions or lacked due process. However, some accounts, particularly those emerging from exile communities, sought to present a more complex narrative, that of a generation caught between two totalitarian regimes, compelled to fight for survival in a war they neither started nor controlled. Despite the end of combat, the experience of the Hungarian Waffen-SS did not vanish. Their legacy became a contested memory within Hungarian society. During the communist era, open discussion of their role was forbidden. In private, however, some veterans recorded their memories in diaries or passed down oral testimonies, painting a picture of hardship, loyalty, and ambiguity. These accounts often conflicted sharply with official state narratives, adding complexity to the nation's post-war identity. By the time Germany unconditionally surrendered on 8 May 1945, the Hungarian Waffen-SS as a formal fighting force had ceased to exist. What remained were its scattered survivors, many imprisoned, some in hiding, and others already lost to the chaos of the war's final days. Yet their story, largely erased from mainstream history, represented a distinct and often overlooked chapter of Central Europe's descent into total war. The final movements of these men, across muddy roads, through broken forests, and into uncertain exile, were the last echoes of a military formation that had stood alone in the Carpathians and held their ground, not for ideology, but for homeland, identity, and the fading hope of sovereignty in a collapsing world order. The crumbling Axis front across the Carpathians and the plains of western Hungary culminated in one of the most overlooked turning points of the Eastern Front, the complete and irreversible collapse of organized Hungarian resistance, including the remnants of the Waffen-SS divisions. By April 1945, the question was no longer one of victory or retreat, but of survival. For the Hungarian Waffen-SS, what followed was a desperate race westward, to escape Soviet capture, to avoid annihilation, and to find any semblance of protection among the Western Allies. This phase marked a significant transition in the character of the Hungarian Waffen-SS. No longer acting as cohesive military units, they devolved into small, mobile groups, often acting independently, making their way through hostile territory. Some moved along the mountain passes of the Alps, while others drifted into rural Austria and southern Germany. Their uniforms were often discarded or altered to avoid identification. Firearms were carried hidden or buried altogether, their only common purpose, to avoid capture at all costs. In the absence of higher command and amid the vacuum of a dissolving Reich, local allegiances shifted quickly. Some Hungarian Waffen-SS detachments merged with Wehrmacht rearguard units still operating in Bavaria and Styria. In towns like Graz and Salzburg, Hungarian fighters were sometimes integrated into ad hoc defense lines, tasked with holding off advancing Soviet patrols or securing escape routes for civilians. However, more often than not, they were treated with suspicion or even hostility by German officers who no longer had the resources or the trust to absorb foreign auxiliary forces into their ranks. Those unable to cross into Western-occupied zones before the Soviet advance frequently faced summary executions. Reports emerged from southern Moravia and Burgenland of Hungarian soldiers being captured by Red Army scouts or local partisans, only to be interrogated, stripped of insignia, and executed without formal trial. In particular, members of the 25th Waffen-SS Division, known to have participated in actions during the defense of Budapest, were deemed high-priority targets by Soviet NKVD units seeking war criminals. Their Waffen-SS affiliation marked them not as regular prisoners of war, but as ideological enemies of the state. The turning point for many came when they reached the demarcation line near the Enns River, where American and Soviet patrols had begun to encounter each other in late April. A number of Hungarian Waffen-SS survivors approached U.S. military checkpoints under white flags or through intermediaries. Some were permitted to surrender their weapons and enter temporary refugee holding zones. Others were detained and later handed over to Soviet authorities, in accordance with Allied agreements regarding the repatriation of Axis nationals. These handovers were rarely transparent. In numerous cases, men disappeared after being transferred, their ultimate fates recorded only in post-war archives or memoirs written in exile. Among those few who escaped Soviet custody, a small number made their way into displaced persons, DP camps, managed by American or British forces. Here, they attempted to reinvent their identities. Many listed themselves as forced laborers, civilian evacuees, or farmhands from Transdanubia, deliberately omitting their service records. However, Allied intelligence officers were often quick to uncover inconsistencies. Interrogations, fingerprinting, and cross-referencing with captured German records resulted in a gradual purge of Waffen-SS members from DP camps. Some were transferred to internment facilities. Others disappeared into post-war underground networks. One such network involved the so-called rat lines, informal escape routes managed by sympathetic clergy, intelligence assets, or former fascist sympathizers. Through forged papers and bribes, a limited number of Hungarian Waffen-SS veterans managed to flee Europe entirely. Destinations included Argentina, where Hungarian émigré communities had long established political ties, as well as Spain, where remnants of the Falangist regime offered limited protection to former Axis personnel. Canada and Australia also absorbed a small number of these fugitives, often unknowingly through broader post-war immigration programs. Inside Hungary, however, there was no escape. Soviet-backed tribunals were swiftly established, and lists of Waffen-SS members were compiled using Red Army reports, local informants, and seized German personnel files. Trials were often held in closed sessions with few procedural safeguards. Public confessions were extracted and broadcast via radio to demonstrate the supposed effectiveness of post-war justice. Former Waffen-SS personnel were executed, imprisoned, or sentenced to labor in Soviet or Hungarian camps. Families were stigmatized. Children of former soldiers were barred from higher education or employment in state institutions. The turning point, then, was not a single battle or date, but the decisive and total transition from combatant to fugitive. The Hungarian Waffen-SS ceased to be a fighting force and became, in essence, a hunted population. Their Waffen-SS designation, once a mark of elite status within the Axis military hierarchy, became a curse. With the collapse of the Nazi state, there was no protector, no appeal, and no negotiation. Their service records became liabilities that followed them across borders and generations. This phase also saw the first attempts to shape the narrative of their wartime role. Some former officers, now in exile, began writing memoirs or smuggling documents to Western publishers, seeking to portray themselves not as ideologues, but as soldiers trapped by history. These accounts often emphasize the defensive nature of their actions, their supposed resistance to Nazism, or their anti-communist convictions. Yet such revisionist narratives rarely withstood scrutiny, especially when compared with wartime documentation or testimonies from occupied populations. In academic circles, the turning point also began to manifest in historiographical shifts. Western historians, granted access to Soviet archives after 1991, uncovered vast quantities of data concerning the activities, composition, and fate of the Hungarian Waffen-SS. What emerged was a more complex picture, one that neither wholly condemned nor vindicated these men. Instead, it emphasized the layers of coercion, nationalism, ideology, and desperation that characterized their enlistment, service, and ultimate fate. This multidimensional collapse, military, institutional, moral, marked the true end of the Hungarian Waffen-SS. No longer actors in a war, they became subjects of history, documented, judged, and, in many cases, forgotten. And yet, in the valleys of Austria, the forests of Western Hungary, and the secret corridors of post-war Europe, the the final choices of these men would echo far beyond the last gunshot of 1945. The cessation of hostilities in May 1945 did not mean the end of consequences for those associated with the Hungarian Waffen-SS. For many, the transition from war to peace brought new perils. The physical exhaustion of years spent fighting in inhospitable terrain was quickly replaced by the psychological weight of survival, guilt, and looming retribution. The aftermath of the campaign in the Carpathians did not simply fade into history. It lingered in courtrooms, interrogation chambers, and exile communities. One of the first areas to experience the full force of post-war reckoning was Hungary itself. Under Soviet occupation and with a new provisional government installed in Budapest, the machinery of political retribution accelerated rapidly. By late 1945, Hungarian people's tribunals were operating in every major city. These tribunals, often comprised of a mix of Communist Party officials, local resistance figures, and Soviet advisors, prioritized the prosecution of former fascist collaborators, including Waffen-SS members. The trials were often swift. Verdicts ranged from long prison terms to capital punishment. The number of Hungarians prosecuted for participation in Waffen-SS units is estimated in the tens of thousands, though reliable figures remain elusive due to incomplete records. Many were convicted solely on the basis of membership, regardless of whether they had seen combat or committed atrocities. Others were judged on more direct evidence, including witness testimonies and captured documents. In some cases, surviving Soviet soldiers or civilians from regions like Transcarpathia or Eastern Slovakia provided first-hand accounts of abuse, looting, or executions attributed to Hungarian units. The most visible and politically charged cases involved officers of the 25th and 26th Waffen-SS divisions, especially those who had served in Budapest and the Carpathians. These high-profile trials were heavily publicized, often used to rally public support for the new regime and legitimize communist authority. They were also intended to send a message to surviving veterans still in hiding. The war might be over, but accountability was. Outside Hungary, the post-war treatment of Hungarian Waffen-SS veterans varied dramatically depending on where they ended up. In the Western occupation zones of Austria and Germany, many were initially interned alongside Wehrmacht soldiers and foreign laborers. Some were held in camps administered by the British or Americans, pending investigations into their wartime activities. Those deemed low risk were gradually released, often after several months of vetting and denazification procedures. However, those suspected of war crimes or ideological extremism faced possible extradition to Hungary or the USSR. In these detention camps, conditions were harsh. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate food plagued facilities such as Dachau, Regensburg, and Wolfsburg. Moreover, language barriers and the relative obscurity of Hungarian military formations made it difficult for Allied investigators to determine precise affiliations. Many Hungarians were simply listed as foreign Waffen-SS personnel and grouped with Baltic, Ukrainian, or Croatian detainees. This anonymity occasionally worked to their advantage, allowing some to slip through repatriation lists or to assume new identities under forged papers. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, captured Hungarian Waffen-SS soldiers were transported to internment camps across Ukraine, Belarus, and Siberia. Some were sent to labor camps in the Urals or Kazakhstan. Repatriation to Hungary was delayed for years. Others never returned. Soviet records indicate that a number of Hungarian prisoners died during transport or perished in camps due to malnutrition, disease, or forced labor. Those who did survive often came back physically broken and politically suspect. By the early 1950s, surviving veterans of the Waffen-SS found themselves in a changed Hungary. The country was now a one-party communist state. Returning prisoners were subjected to further interrogation and surveillance. Many were denied employment in state institutions. Some were forced into manual labor or relocated to rural areas under internal exile policies. Their families were also affected. Children were denied access to universities, and spouses faced stigmatization in public life. In contrast, a smaller number of Hungarian Waffen-SS veterans managed to build new lives abroad. In West Germany, émigré organizations provided shelter and employment, though public association with the Waffen-SS was increasingly frowned upon in the post-Nuremberg era. In South America, particularly Argentina and Brazil, former soldiers integrated into diaspora communities, often living under assumed names. Here, they remained largely beyond the reach of Allied or Communist justice, though they carried the burden of secrecy and exile. Despite state repression, private memory of the Hungarian Waffen-SS endured. In rural Hungary, particularly in regions where recruitment had been heaviest, oral histories preserved fragmented stories of battles, hardships, and escape. Among some, these stories were tinged with regret. Among others, with a sense of misunderstood patriotism or misplaced loyalty. This legacy would later resurface in debates over historical memory during the waning years of the Cold War. As early as the 1960s, a few Hungarian historians in exile began publishing memoirs and unofficial histories of the Carpathian campaign. These works often sought to contextualize the actions of the Waffen-SS units within the broader collapse of Hungarian sovereignty and the pressures of the Axis alliance. Others, particularly in Eastern Europe, dismissed these narratives as revisionist or self-exculpatory. Still, they contributed to a growing body of work that attempted to document the complexity of the period. In official Soviet historiography, the Hungarian Waffen-SS were consistently depicted as reactionary tools of German imperialism. Their resistance in the Carpathians was portrayed not as a military stand, but as a criminal prolongation of a doomed cause. This narrative dominated textbooks, museums, and memorial culture throughout the Eastern Bloc, reinforcing the perception of the Waffen-SS as ideological enemies of the people. But reality was far more nuanced. Many of the Hungarian recruits had joined under coercion, economic pressure, or nationalist sentiment. Some had hoped to defend their homeland. Others were motivated by anti-communist fears. Their fates were shaped not only by their actions in battle, but by the geopolitical currents that swept across Europe in the war's final months. Thus, the aftermath of the Carpathian stand is inseparable from the larger tragedies of post-war Central Europe. It is a story of shattered lives, unfinished justice, and contested memory, a chapter defined not by the clash of armies alone, but by what followed when the shooting stopped. The legacy of the Hungarian Waffen-SS and the Carpathians remains one of the most debated and least understood aspects of Central European history during World War II. For decades, this chapter lay buried beneath Cold War politics, national trauma, and ideological polarization. Only in recent years has it become possible to approach the events with greater historical clarity and nuance, disentangling memory from myth and propaganda from documentation. The significance of the Hungarian Waffen-SS's defense of the Carpathian region lies not only in its immediate military consequences, but also in the way it encapsulated the larger tragedy of Hungary's wartime trajectory. By late 1944, Hungary had become a battleground, not just between the Axis and the Allies, but between competing visions of its own future: fascist authoritarianism, German-aligned nationalism, Soviet-backed communism, and a longing for a return to sovereignty that had been eroded since the Treaty of Trianon. In many ways, the final stand of the Hungarian SS units in the Carpathians served as a symbolic endpoint for Hungary's wartime alignment with Nazi Germany. As these troops fought isolated and outnumbered in the snowy passes of northern Transylvania and Ruthenia, the state they were defending was already fracturing. Horthy had been deposed. Szalasi's Arrow Cross regime had little control beyond Budapest. The German Wehrmacht was in retreat, and the Red Army was steadily advancing. The Hungarian soldiers found themselves defending not a coherent state, but the remnants of one, fragments of identity, loyalty, and territory. Despite their tactical successes in stalling Soviet progress in mountain corridors, the defense of the Carpathians did not alter the broader strategic outcome. The Red Army's push toward Vienna and Prague continued. Hungary, by April 1945, was fully occupied by Soviet forces. The defense of the mountains delayed but could not prevent the inevitable. Yet, for military historians, the campaign offers a valuable case study in asymmetrical warfare, terrain exploitation, and the use of elite volunteer formations in defensive roles. The Hungarian Waffen-SS, often reinforced by remnants of other retreating Axis units, managed to maintain organized resistance in some sectors far longer than expected. Their knowledge of the mountainous terrain, familiarity with winter conditions, and established defensive positions enabled them to inflict considerable delays on advancing Soviet and Romanian forces. Even after regular communications with German command structures were lost, many of these units continued fighting autonomously, relying on local resupply and improvisation. Modern scholarship has also begun to reassess the composition and motivation of these units. While Waffen-SS formations were ideologically linked to the Nazi regime, their Hungarian contingents were far from homogeneous. Conscripts, reluctant volunteers, career soldiers, and ideological extremists all served side by side. Some joined for patriotic reasons, others to avoid deportation to German labor battalions. This diversity of backgrounds complicates simplistic portrayals of the Hungarian SS as uniformly fanatical or criminal. The legacy also lives on in how the Carpathian campaign is remembered or not remembered in Hungary today. For decades under communist rule, any mention of the Waffen-SS was taboo, associated exclusively with war crimes and fascist collaboration. Veterans were silenced and research was suppressed. Only after the fall of the Iron Curtain did archival access and political openness allow for more balanced studies. However, even now, the subject remains contentious. Attempts to study or memorialize the Hungarian SS are often accused of whitewashing, while official narratives still avoid the complexities of the era. The Carpathian defense also raised unresolved questions about national memory, particularly in relation to Hungary's place within the Axis alliance. Should Hungary's actions be seen solely as those of a puppet state serving Nazi Germany, or were they also a reflection of a desperate attempt to assert national interests, however misguided, in the face of Soviet occupation? These questions extend beyond historical inquiry into the realm of national identity and collective memory. In local communities across the former frontline areas, the war left scars that outlasted the soldiers. Villages burned during retreats, families displaced by advancing armies, and graveyards filled with unmarked or anonymous soldiers. These became the silent markers of a forgotten campaign. Some local traditions, especially in the highlands of Ruthenia and Transylvania, retain stories of the winter battles, passed down without clear ideological framing, just memories of fear, cold, and loss. In neighboring countries, the legacy was similarly ambiguous. In Romania and Slovakia, wartime memories were reshaped to emphasize national victimhood or resistance against fascism, often omitting the complexities of regional collaboration or divided loyalties. The Hungarian SS presence in these areas was rarely discussed in public discourse, even though many of the engagements took place within their borders. Internationally, the Hungarian Waffen-SS received limited attention compared to more infamous formations such as the Latvian Legion, the Galician Division, or the 5th SS Panzer Division, Wiking. This relative obscurity contributed to the persistence of stereotypes and oversimplified narratives. Yet for those seeking to understand the final, fragmented stages of the European war, the defense of the Carpathians remains a key puzzle piece. Today, historians continue to piece together the full picture through recovered unit diaries, declassified Soviet reports, and testimonies preserved in exile archives. Museums in Hungary and Central Europe have gradually begun to address the campaign, though always with caution. The risk of political appropriation remains high. Some far-right groups seek to mythologize the Waffen-SS as defenders of the homeland. Others, in contrast, argue that any commemoration constitutes an endorsement of fascism. Between these extremes, the historian's task remains clear: to document, analyze, and present the evidence without bias. The story of the Hungarian Waffen-SS and the Carpathians is neither one of heroism nor villainy alone. It is a story of desperation, ideology, survival, and loss. It reminds us that history is not black and white, but shaped by the choices of individuals trapped in circumstances beyond their control. As the snow melts in the mountain passes they once defended, and the bunkers crumble into the earth, what remains is not just the memory of a battle, but the enduring question of how nations remember their pasts, and at what cost they do so.